Hey Reddit, when did your something's not right here gut feeling ever save you? Wife called me while I was at work, just to say she was home from her night shift and planning to go to bed. She had worked night shift for years and never called me just to say she was home and going to bed before. She also sounded weirdly detached on the call. I asked her if she was okay. She said yes, just really sleepy. I got a weird feeling and told her I was going to leave work and come home. She told me I didn't need to. I said okay, and then I left work and rushed home anyway. Found a suicide note taped to the garage door. I got to her in time, rushed her to the ER, and got her the help she needed. A week of inpatient psych, followed by changes to medications and doctors. This was about 5 months ago, and she is so much better now. I used to just drive around country roads when I would feel stressed out or sad as a way to just get away and listen to music. One evening I was driving with my best friend in the car and we're on a gravel road that has a huge hill. We were driving towards the sunset, but it was winter and the light was fading fast. As the car started down the hill, I had this moment where I thought to myself my brights should be on, and I flicked them on, and at the bottom of this super steep hill stood 6 deer on the road. I slammed on the brakes and the car turned sideways and skidded to a stop like 4 feet from the deer. Those stupid deer didn't even move. They just stared into the passenger side of my car, and my best friend pointed at them and said, "Hey, deer." The car was fine. We were fine. And Bambi was all good. I don't drive around like that anymore. My mom and her entire family were saved from dying from carbon monoxide poisoning by her dad. He left for work, got a weird feeling and drove back home. Everyone in the house was unconscious, and he had to drag or carry them all outside one by one. They all survived. My sister, since she was about 5, was always obsessed with tsunamis and would always ask my dad every night before she went to sleep if there would be a tsunami that night. We lived on a beach. About 5 years later, when our family was holidaying in Samoa, an earthquake struck at about 6 AM. It was only a dull low rumble but went on for over a minute. Everyone at the resort woke up and went outside for a few minutes, then went back to bed. My sister, having been obsessed with tsunamis, ran down to look at the water and noticed the sea going out and saved a lot of lives, including my own. There was about a minute from her noticing till that tsunami hit. Luckily for us, there was a cliff right behind the resort. If not, a lot more people would have been killed. So something like a gut feeling 5 years in the making. Not me, but my science teacher. When she was a teenager, she was standing near some lights at a pedestrian crossing with her and her friend. Very chill, but out of nowhere she had this gut feeling that both of them had to move. They moved just a couple meters away, and the next moment a car had hit another car and had hit one of the street electricity utility poles, and it had fell and exploded. Minor explosion enough distance away that it didn't hurt the girls, exactly where they were. One of the wires had also snapped and hit it exactly where they were standing as well. They basically were in a scene of car wreckage and snapped wires and electricity explosions and the pole collapse. Just real insane. If the pole had missed them, the wire would have hit them, and if not that, then most likely the cars. That gut feeling of moving away saved both of them. I remember this story so clearly from high school science class because it was such a WTF. Pity I only paid attention to these things and not actually science-y. And I went to hospital with shortness of breath and my heart racing. They did a chest x-ray, blood test for blood clots, ECG, and a few other tests, but all came back normal. After observing me overnight, everything still looked good. Oxygen saturation was perfect. My heart rate was still a bit elevated but nothing too crazy, and it seemed that it was likely leftover symptoms from a bad virus that I'd had a week or so earlier. The ER doctor asks me how I would feel if they sent me home, and I just had a bad feeling about it all. I told him as such, and that I had no real basis for it except that I just felt off about it. He said, "Fair enough. Let's try one more test, and if that comes back negative, then we'll send you up to general medicine and see if they can track something down." That test was a VQ scan that found, despite all other tests showing no results for blood clots, I actually had a whole bunch of them in both lungs. I ended up with a diagnosis of unprovoked bilateral pulmonary embolisms and am on blood thinners for life. Super grateful both for the bad feeling and the ER doctor who was willing to listen to it. EMT here. I was taught if a patient tells you they think something is wrong or they think they are going to die, you need to listen to them. Same for nurses. There is a legit nursing diagnosis called sense of impending doom that is in reference to this feeling. Someone can't explain what is wrong and there's nothing obvious, but we need to take it seriously. The body somehow feels something wrong when the brain can't find the words. I found this to be very common with pulmonary emboli, heart attacks, and strokes. The body is so weird. I woke up from a deep sleep at like 2 AM during a winter storm. Something wasn't right. I immediately went looking for my senior dog and couldn't find her anywhere in the house. My roommates had a tendency to let her out for a walk and forget about her, closing the door. I ran to the front of the house and found her laying on the welcome mat. She was hardly breathing and covered in snow. She had been outside alone for at the very least 5 hours. I moved out shortly after. Jesus, that's awful. Did your dog wind up recovering from the ordeal? Also, seriously, who the fuck forgets they let a dog out? Glad you got out of there. She was better after an hour or two. I forfeit my sleep and warmed her up slowly and gave her plenty of munchy food when she was back up to snuff. Her and I were very lucky she wasn't out there much longer. I was learning violin when I was about 10 from an instructor at my local music shop. I got the weirdest feeling from him even though he didn't do anything out of the ordinary. I wanted to vomit every time I looked at him, especially his hands. After 4 lessons I told my parents that I had a terrible feeling about him and I never wanted to go back. Luckily, they listened and didn't make me ever go to him again. A few years later he was arrested for molesting multiple of his students. I have no idea how I knew something was off. He never did or said anything but I just felt it. Creds to my dad for this one. Back in 2011, my dad and I was driving down the country for New Year's Eve. Suddenly he goes quiet, kind of starts breathing slow and steady, and tells me to look up the road. He was so calm and focused. I look up and see a car spinning in the middle of the freeway, ramping up speed and knocking cars off the road. This is Scandinavia, winter, pretty much on ice. I imagine the driver of that car hoping, just hoping. So my dad proceeds to accelerate towards the guy spinning, which didn't even occur to me was weird. He was just so calm, which made me calm. The car hits us on my dad's side. Half a second earlier my dad turned slightly right, which was just enough for the car to push us out of the road and completely safe into a snarl. I realized a bit later that a lamppost on that same side we flew off to had crushed the back right side of our car, just missing the angle that would have hit me. Years later I realized the reason my dad sped up the vehicle. Getting hit by that car was a question of when, not if, and if he had not accelerated, that lamppost would have been my death. After that occurrence my pulse always drops in pressure situations. Your dad had the time-stop adrenaline response that allowed him to make decisions with a clear head. It's a literal lifesaver. I'm glad you're still here. When I was in college, I lived in a sketchy part of Chicago, Humboldt Park, Logan Square before gentrification. I liked to take late-night strolls, even when I was living in that neighborhood as a 20-year-old woman. Yeah, I know. Pretty dumb of me. One night, I was feeling stressed out so I embarked on one of my late-night strolls. I was walking along a somewhat busy road. Cars were zooming past me. Pretty normal. I wasn't paying much attention because I was too wrapped up in whatever was stressing me out that night. Suddenly, a chill shot up my spine. Hypervigilance washed over me and I became more alert than I had ever been. Something was wrong. Someone was watching me. I quickly spotted a car. It was driving in the opposite direction, a little slower than usual. It was too dark for me to see anyone inside the car, and the car was pretty unassuming. But I still knew something was off. They were watching me. I just knew. The car drove past me and then made a U-turn. Now it was right behind me, creeping along the curb. Luckily, there was a Walgreens a few blocks ahead. I started walking faster, and the car eventually sped past me and disappeared into a corner. I somehow knew I wasn't safe yet, so I still sprinted to Walgreens. I told the security guard what happened, and we both went outside. The car was parked up the street, about 50-100 feet away. The security guard was a big guy who looked intimidating. He marched toward the car, and the car immediately backed up, made a U-turn, and then booked it out of there. The security guard called the cops, and they drove me home. I never took a late night stroll again. My gut made me more alert, but it was really the security guard who saved my life. I'm positive that if he wasn't there that night, something bad would have happened to me. I wish I could find that security guard to thank him. When I was about 10 years old, I was going to the beach with my older sister, her friends and their parents. They had a van that was open in the back. Think white creepy van, no seats. The other friends of my sister's friends took turns sitting on the father's lap when he asked if they wanted to steer the van. He then asked me and my gut said no. This man is creepy as fuck. The look in his eyes sent shivers down my spine. Once we got to the beach, I forgot all about creepy guy and focused on fun. Fast forward several months later, my sister's friends asked if my sister wanted to sleep over. She refused and my mom and I were baffled as to why she didn't want to go. We kept encouraging her to. Soon she broke down in tears and told us that one night their father had molested her. The van incident and feelings came flying back to me. I wish I had not forgotten my gut feeling and shared it with my mother and sister before anything happened to my sister. Sometimes I still feel guilty over it. That was over 30 years ago. I don't remember what happened to the guy. I just remember a state vehicle at my house a lot afterwards. No one ever talked about it again and I never asked. Was sitting on one of those metal cylindrical electricity boxes outside my house when there was a blackout. Electricity was slightly flickering in my house. No other houses had a blackout. I looked down at what I was sitting on and I was like, maybe this is the source of the problem. I stood up and stepped away from it and like 2 seconds later it fucking blew up. Like a pillar of flame shot out and above it for almost a full minute. It was basically a gigantic Bunsen burner and I was a few seconds short of physically getting fried. I was walking out of a grocery store when I saw this kid about to cross the road. Something came over me and I yanked him back onto the sidewalk. Not even a second later a truck came flying past. He was probably around 7 or 8ish. Someone did this for me when I was a teen. My high school was downtown so I walked around down there a fair amount. I was standing on the very edge of the curb waiting to cross and a guy behind me grabbed my shirt and pulled me back from the edge of the road. We exchanged a mutual "are you crazy" look. When I turned back to the road, one of the city buses flew past. They have these huge side mirrors that stick out pretty far. Probably it wouldn't have actually hit me, but it would have been close. I turned back to thank the guy, but he was gone. I went out with my best friend on New Year's last year and were having drinks with her friends when I realized I was out of cigarettes. I left for a few minutes to walk over and grab a pack and ended up talking to a homeless guy for a while. And when I went over to the entrance of the bar she was outside and said something mean to me for no reason and walked off. I was confused so I decided it would be good if I took a walk to let her cool off and then figure out what she was upset about. I was going to walk down the street for a bit but something told me to turn left, walking behind the bar and then turning to the side of the bar when I see a girl laying down on the sidewalk and people walking by her. As I'm walking over to help I realize it's my friend and she's not very conscious. She was probably drugged while I was getting smokes and who knows what would have happened if I hadn't decided to go that way scares the shit out of me. Wow, this is such a fear of mine. I live in Vegas and there's a ton of people that drug other people's drinks. So glad it was you that found her. Once I was at the bank doing business with the ATM. I noticed a black and yellow van parked with a man in the driver's seat. The van was off, and he was just sitting there. Made me uncomfortable, so I didn't want to go home. Instead, I got in my car and moved to the other side of the parking lot near a hardware store and outdoor recycling center. It was broad daylight. I just sat in my car pretending to read, and the van started up and moved down to my side of the parking lot. Again, he reversed the van into a parking spot that was facing my car. Now I knew that I shouldn't go home, which was nearby, so instead, I got out and went to visit the two men who were manning the recycling center. I asked if I could sit on their extra chair because the van guy was making me uncomfortable. They said sure, and since business was slow, we got to chatting. I asked them how they liked the work and how business had been. The van guy finally started up his van and left, after I took a picture of it and texted the info to my husband. After another 10 minutes with the guys, I took a circuitous route home to make sure the van wasn't anywhere around. The kicker is this. I asked the guys how long they'd been working at the recycling station, and they said about 4 months. I'm like, oh, what did you do before this? And they both go, oh, we were in prison before. Well, whatevers. They still saved me. Prison dudes aren't always bad people. Sometimes they're just in a bad place. One thing for sure is that sex offenders are at high risk of receiving jail yard justice. I was walking to the barber shop, and for some reason, everything just felt off. I ignored the feeling, but every step I took just made me feel like something wasn't right, so I decided to just go grab some food and come back. While I was eating, I saw police cars and ambulances driving to around where I was before. It turns out there was a murder. Now I always listen to my gut feeling. It didn't save me, but I saved someone else. When I was 6, my brother, 8 at the time, and I would go to my grandma's house while our mom worked late some nights. Anyway, one day I was just randomly thinking about fire alarms. I don't know what caused me to think about it, but after I started I couldn't stop. I have ADHD, this super focus thing, so whenever I'm thinking about something as simple as fire alarms it consumes my mind. I asked my grandma and she said she hadn't tested hers in a while, just for kicks. She didn't. Sure enough, the batters were dead. She replaced the batters and made sure they worked. The very next morning her house caught on fire while she was asleep. If she didn't hear the fire alarms she would have been trapped in her room on the 2nd story without a phone or any way to contact help. She most likely would have died. I always make sure fire detectors alarms work in my house now. Edit. Batteries. Forgot one. About 10 years ago, working security at a site about 50 miles from home, got off shift at midnight, and didn't bother to change out of uniform because I was only going to stop for gas. 2 stations in the town I was working in were open after midnight, but it slipped my mind as I drove past the first one. Pulled into the other, same brand, same gas price, same sort of dump entirely, and just didn't like something about it. Nobody else around but the clerk that I could see, but I decided to go back to the other one. Topped off and headed back out of town. I get close to that station again. 3 city cop cars, 2 deputies and a state trooper are outside blocking the road with guns drawn. Turns out a city cop walked in on a robbery. Dude put a bullet in his vest, and the store owner knocked the robber out cold with a bat before the cop could recover enough to get his gun out. That would have been me, in a uniform with a nice shiny badge, but no body armor. My wife and I were in the middle of nowhere in the middle of the night in rural Kentucky on a road trip, and for some reason we needed to adjust some of our luggage. I pulled into a gas station that looked empty so we could fix whatever the problem was, and parked in the middle of the gas station's unusually large parking lot. As I was walking around the car, I noticed that there were silhouettes of people surrounding the parking lot. It freaked me the fuck out, and I jumped back into the car, locked the doors, and got ready to peel out of the place. I turned on my headlights as I was turning around, and they were just statues. Medusa almost got you. I'm afraid of roller coasters, mostly heights, but they go hand in hand. My friends and I went to a theme park and went on one that was in darkness and went underground. I rode it once, sitting in the back, and really enjoyed it surprisingly. When we reached the start again, there was no line, as it was the end of the day, so they asked if we wanted a final go before they shut down. Something in my gut told me not to go on, so, despite my friends nagging, I didn't and waited with the bags. My friend came back around a few minutes later white as a sheet. About 3/4 of the way through the ride, there's a big drop, then it goes fast, and just before that, my friend in the back's bar had risen up. Apparently they had to grip onto her for the rest of the ride whilst trying to push the bar back down. Oh god, that's my worst nightmare. I was 15 years old and my mom dropped me off at McDonald's to get breakfast while she went across the street to get Starbucks. It was a shopping mall in suburbia and we were on the way to pick up a new kitten a few hours away. Instead of walking the 100 yards to my mom, I sat outside waiting for her to pick me up. Teenagers, I guess. As I'm standing there, a guy in an old station wagon with 2 kids in the back starts talking to me. He asks me where I'm going and I say whatever town it was. He says he's going there too with his kids and asks if I want to come. I tell him no, that my mom is across the street, and he comes closer. My gut is saying something is off, so I see a random woman walk out of Starbucks and I point to her and say that's my mom right there. He freaked out and left really quick. I still remember those 2 kids in the back seat. They looked so off. I wonder to this day if they are okay. Edit 1. I did not tell my mom and I don't know why. I think I was scared she would be upset with me and not want to go get a kitten. I was barely 15 and teenagers are selfish buttheads. I finally told her a few years ago and she was super upset about it. I was so freaked out I didn't even think to get a plate. I grew up in suburbia, but the rich kind of suburbia where this kind of stuff was never talked about. I wasn't into true crime, so I had no idea what you're supposed to do. If I had the knowledge I have now, I obviously would have handled it totally differently. I matched with a guy on Tinder. We exchanged messages, and everything was fine, normal. We decided we would meet up for coffee in a week. A few days after we arranged the coffee date, he messaged me saying his father had passed away in those few days. He couldn't meet me in public. He could only meet me in private at his apartment. I trusted my gut, sent my condolences, but said I couldn't meet him somewhere private. He tried to tell me I could trust him because he had a dog. I still declined. He got really aggressive and started messaging me horrible things. He called me every name in the book. I ended up blocking him. I tried to find him later on, and he basically never existed. He could have blocked me on all social media, but I couldn't find a trace of him anywhere. I don't know what the outcome would have been, but I just couldn't do it. I smelled burning plastic early in the morning at my family cottage and almost went back to sleep. I was around 15, but got up to investigate. A socket on the outside of the building had caught fire and flames were shooting up the wall. The rest of my family was still sleeping and there wasn't enough smoke for the alarms to go off. I ran and got a fire extinguisher, got my dad up, and put it in his hands and pointed him towards the fire. Stopped it and called the fire department. A few years ago, when I was 19 and studying abroad in Europe, and my friend and I decided to go to Turkey. It was our first time really traveling on our own without a group, and we decided to walk around the square outside of the Blue Mosque. We felt very safe during the day and decided to see the city at night with the lights. As we were in the square, we were hounded by typical store owners trying to sell us something. Finally, most went away, and as we were going back to our hotel, a younger guy approached us. He said he had a shop on the corner, which he pointed to with lots of souvenirs including carpets. I grew up with a lot of handmade, woven carpets from my parents' travels to the Middle East and Asia. I decided it would be a nice gift. So we follow him. When we get to what we thought was his shop, we stopped. We started to walk in and he said, "Not that one, the one around the corner." We poke our head around and sure enough see a store, only selling carpets. I started to get a slightly strange feeling but nothing overwhelming, so we followed him as we could see the store. When we walked in, about 13-15 other men were in the shop. They were pointing out carpets and showing us around, and I started to get really uncomfortable. My friend seemed completely at ease, so we followed the group around the bend to the other part of the store. In Turkey, it is common to be offered tea, so that part is not particularly odd, but the men, who were now circling us, were insistent that we have tea with them in the basement. I kept saying no, but they were leading us towards steps, completely surround us. We got to the steps and my friend started walking down. My body began to sweat, my heart went crazy, and I never had such an overwhelming fear. I kept trying to think of how we could overpower these men. I grabbed my phone, stopped in my tracks, and gasped. Friend's name, we need to go right now. My mom just texted me asking why we aren't back at the hotel yet cause the map shows we're at this store. We're supposed to FaceTime with them in 10 minutes. The men kind of look around and tell us we can have tea in less than that amount of time. I keep insisting that my parents are freaking out because they can tell we're in the carpet store and not the hotel, and that they will likely contact the embassy if we don't get going. They continued blocking the staircase. I told them that we would come 40 in the morning as I still really wanted a carpet and that we needed to get out of the store and back to FaceTime. It took a little persuading, but they eventually opened a path for us to go to the door. One of them followed us back to the square insisting that we come back and see them. Of course, we didn't. I have no idea if they were completely harmless or not, but I had never had such an overwhelming feeling. They easily could have drugged us, placed us in carpets, and taken us out. My parents didn't actually have our location as my phone was on airplane mode. So who actually knows? On the other hand, I might have been paranoid, but it wasn't a situation I ever wanted to be in again. Once we were back at the hotel, she told me she was really scared too, but that she thought I was fine, so she went with it. Yeah, if a group of dudes or anyone in a foreign country was trying to convince me to go into a basement, that's a no. I had gone to this bar back home with a few friends, and afterwards everyone was supposed to go to this house party. I was game to go from the moment I was invited. Halfway through the night I had this gut feeling to not go. I told my best friend that she shouldn't go, but she insisted that she wanted to go because there were a few cute guys there. I couldn't shake the feeling that we shouldn't go, but she talked me into it. When we got in my car to head to the party, the guy feeling was worse. I grew up around cars and drive a manual. My best friend is completely clueless when it comes to cars, so I deliberately grinded the gears and jerked the car and made it stall, acting like something was wrong. I pretended to try to fix what wasn't broken, and after about 15-20 minutes of fixing my car, cops and fire trucks followed by EMS flew by us. I fixed my car but told my best friend that I just wasn't feeling well, and she agreed and said my car breaking down ruined her mood, so we went back to my place to watch movies. About an hour after getting home we got a call from a friend of ours saying that the girl who owned the house and who was throwing the party was cheating on her husband who was deployed and came back in leave to surprise her and caught her in bed with his buddy. Dude pulled a gun and started shooting at this girl and his friend while everyone else fled the house. Few years back I went to uni in Brussels. I would always take the train to get there. One morning I just woke up and didn't feel great at all. Keep in mind I have had a horrible flare-up of Crohn's for the last weeks. But this felt different. Guess it was my gut. So instead of pushing through it like I did with Crohn's, I decided to stay home for once. This was the only day out of 2 that I ever stayed home from uni. That day the terror attack happened on the train that I usually ride to get to uni. I was in one of these metro trains just 5 minutes before it happened. I always stop at Utsloy, the stop right after Mielbeek. We went through Mielbeek no problem. While I was waiting for my correspondence in AL, I was browsing the news on my phone and saw that an attack happened at the airport less than half an hour before. I swear my first thought at that time was, why the hell haven't they cancelled all trains yet? My metro arrived, I really hesitated, but I still got on board and I scanned everybody in my train, ready to get off if one nervous guy with an oversized jacket was in it. Then arrived at Botanic, after 2 stops, no problem, feeling relieved. As soon as I was at my desk in the office, less than 10 minutes later, a colleague told me, "Oh my god, you're alright? You've heard about the attack?" I said yes. At the airport, she said no. In Mielbeek, my very first feeling was not fear or sadness, it was pure anger. I'm not working for the police or anything, but of course if I had been in charge, I would have just stopped all public transport traffic the minute the attack at the airport took place. It was such a no-brainer. Still very angry this day. I didn't know anybody who got killed, but one of my friend lost a colleague, and another friend was at the airport next to the American Airlines queue. He got lucky, he needed to pee just 2 minutes before the attack, so he was in the restroom when it happened.